Hello and welcome back to Pi 3. Thank you for sticking with the online learning course. The ideas we talked about will be followed up in face-to-face opportunities. So we have looked so far at what Pi is, why it's important, and we've highlighted the link between trauma, mental health and homelessness. So this video today is going to be about what Pi's look like in practice. So Pi, developing as a Pi, is a process and it is a journey, and there's not really one point in time where a service is or isn't a Pi. It's really about a continual process of reflection and action, and that's really what's important. So we're going to explore each element of Pi from the perspective of an organisational service who would identify themselves as progressing within these ideas. So we'll look at each element in turn and think about what that might look like from somebody who was observing the service. So if you went and visited another service, what would you be looking for in a service that was identified as progressing within their Pi practice? And you might want to then think about, where you feel your service is in relation to these ideas and what the next steps would be to take, that step further forward. So let's start with psychological awareness. So what you might observe in a service that was progressing with these ideas is that staff and perhaps service users and you would hope managers and sort of organisational leads could identify clearly what the ideas are that is guiding what you do. So what is important to you as a service with regard to how you understand the needs of the people you are working with, and therefore what you do to try and support them. So that might be about identifying relationships, and strong nurturing relationships is a key element of change. It might also be about identifying the role of trauma in everything that you do, so really bringing forth an awareness of how people's vulnerability from past experience might be triggered in the here and now, and really sort of being able to think about that as a staff team. It might be about identifying the importance of highlighting people's strengths and showing gratitude. So, it can be really sometimes similar or different for different services about what the key ideas are that inform what you do. So it's really about, can people name those things? And getting to that point is a process and often not easy. So the next element is staff training and support. So what you might observe if you were visiting a service that was progressing as a Pi would be that there were clear different spaces for staff to seek support, places for reflection, places for learning, places to celebrate strengths and generally process your experience. So this might be group reflective practice, might be case discussions, might be one-to-one clinically focused supervision or support. It might also be peer supervision, peer groups, buddying. That can be really useful too. The other thing that you would observe is that the service you were visiting had a clear training plan that felt useful to staff and was linked to the psychological approach and principles that had been identified. And that would be an ongoing sort of reflection on what was needed in regard to training. So when you were then thinking about the spaces of opportunity element of Pi, if you were visiting a service, you would observe that the physical environment where the relationships were being built had been carefully thought about. So if it's a physical building, changes had been made so that staff and service users felt safe at every point in their journey with the service. That people have had privacy and safe places to talk, and that the environment made people feel valued in the way that it was designed. And if you were visiting a service that wasn't a building-based service, you would notice the careful thinking about where interactions were taking place. The other element is about whether people have thought about their relationships with wider networks and how relationships are built in terms of the community of people involved in supporting service users. So the fourth element, culture of inquiry or learning and inquiry, what you would notice in a developing service is that you would be able to hear staff talk about key processes for learning when challenges occur. So you'd be able to observe when something difficult occurs, the process of staff sitting down, reflecting on it, thinking about the context of what happened, taking learning from that and putting it into actions, things that could be done to improve services. And you would observe that that was done in a supportive and safe way, that there wasn't any element of blame, but the focus was on curiously trying to understand and learn from experience. And you might notice that data was collected, but that the focus was on learning from that. And you would also be able to see that service users had a key role in improving and developing services. So the fifth element, rules, roles and responsibilities. What you would observe in a developing service would be that staff would be able to talk about and show you their proactive plans for managing relationships, for working with times of distress. And you would notice that sort of the ways of how the service runs were written down or expressed clearly for both staff and service users, so that people knew what to expect. And you'd be able to observe that staff and service users had a role and a voice in how things were organised within the service. So again, you would see that service users were involved in decision making and improvements. So within the PIE approach, as we've talked about, reflection and relationships are key and integral to all of these elements. And if you were visiting a service who's progressing in their PIE practice, you would hear staff talk about relationships and reflection as being key things that are important to them and a part of the crafting, if you like, of what they do. So you would see reflective practice not only in group protected time, but you would see it within all the rhythms and routines of a service and an individual practitioner's practice. So you'd be able to see people taking time to think and respond to situations and reflect on what's happened. And you would hear people talking about relationships as being key. And some of the things you might notice that staff talked about in terms of building relationships were values such as openness, transparency, respect, honesty, direct communication, non-judgment, empathy and kindness. And those values and ethics can be individual to staff members and groups and services. And one thing you might want to do is sit down individually and with your team and think about what of those ethics and values really are meaningful to you and what they look like in practice, and perhaps what it looks like when you're pulled away from those values and ethics. So we all have a responsibility, as we've talked about, in developing PIE. I would recommend it's really useful if you could note down some things that you want to take forward from what we've talked about. It is a basic foundation in these ideas, and there's a lot more to talk about and unpick. And everyone has an opportunity to engage in that. So have a look at the key reading that's recommended, fill in the learning questionnaire, and get in touch with any questions about anything we've talked about, and have a chat with your colleagues, your team members, your managers, your staff about things that they've been interested in, things that they're curious about in terms of what we've been talking about. So the next video will be video 1 of the trauma-informed practice videos, and there'll be 3 of those videos coming every 2 weeks. So thank you for listening and see you then.